The scientific method. This is the method used typically by scientists to do experiments in order to test their hypotheses or answer questions. Throughout the experimentation process, scientists use observations. This can be any description of an object or event that's occurring, and it usually includes data from all 5 senses. The observations can be recorded as drawings or diagrams or written descriptions or words or numbers, but it's important to remember that they do not include opinions. There are 2 types of observations. You can have a qualitative observation, which is a description that's written in words. For example, if I said that the object being tested was red and was warm to the touch, those are qualitative observations. Or you can have quantitative observations, which are descriptions using numbers. Anytime you measure something, for example, I could say the container of liquid, instead of saying it was warm to the touch, I could say it was 38 degrees Celsius. That is a quantitative measurement of the temperature. After making those observations, it's important to remember the difference between an observation and an inference. An inference is when you take those observations and you make a conclusion. And these conclusions often provide a reason for whatever event or object you are observing. In a controlled experiment, and it's always good that your experiments are controlled, there are 2 groups. There's the control group, which is the part of the experiment that is left alone or left natural, but you still take all of the measurements for that group, and you use this to compare it to the experimental group. The other group is called the experimental group. This is the setup within the experiment where the scientist or researcher is looking at specifically the independent variable and its effect on the dependent variable. The independent variable is going to be some factor that is present in the experimental group but not in the control. For example, if we look at an experiment done with ketchup, we could ask the question, is the thickness of ketchup affected by refrigeration? Our control group would be unrefrigerated ketchup because that's how you would normally find it in the grocery store. And our experimental group would include ketchup at different temperatures. So in order to continue, you have to know what a variable is. Variables are any factor in an experiment that is measured or controlled. This can be a wide variety of things. There are some specific variables that scientists or researchers look at. The first, they choose their independent variable. This is whatever they are choosing to test, whatever factor or category that they're testing the effect of. And for simplicity, experiments only have one independent variable, but the better you are at doing an experiment, the more complex you can get and the more variables you can do. The other type of variable is the dependent or responding variable. This is the factor that you measure as a result of the independent variable. And lastly, there are controlled variables or constants, which no matter which group you're in, you're going to keep these factors the same. In our ketchup experiment, we could say that our independent variable is the temperature at which the ketchup is stored. And in this case, this experiment uses 3 different temperatures. The dependent variable, we had to figure out a way to measure the thickness of the ketchup and to get an actual measurement for that. So the researcher decided that they would measure how long or the amount of time that it takes the ketchup to drip off a spoon, assuming that the thicker it is, the longer it will take to drip off the spoon. And then the constants that are in both groups would be things like the brand of ketchup, the amount they use on the spoon, the type of spoon, the testing location, the thermometer for recording the temperatures, whether the ketchup bottle gets shaken before the time is measured, and so on. So back to our parts of an experiment. We have a research question or a problem. For example, is the thickness of ketchup affected by refrigeration? And then you have a hypothesis. This is typically stated in a certain way in order to make sure that all the points are covered. So I tell my students, you need to use an if then because statement. You always have to support whatever you think is going to happen with a reason, and you would state it in this manner. The if would go with your independent variable, the then would be your dependent variable, and the because would be your scientific reason. It's always important to use positive language, saying this will occur, not it might occur. So for example, for the ketchup experiment, your hypothesis would say, if ketchup is stored at a colder temperature, then it will take more time to drip off a spoon because the cold temp allows the ketchup to congeal, which makes it thicker. So you see, the if is our temperatures, the then is the time it takes to drip off the spoon, and the because is our reasoning behind it all. The next part of an experiment, if you were doing one from start to finish, would be to write the procedure for the experiment. This includes both the items used during the experiment or the materials and the step-by-step directions, kind of written like a recipe. Those steps are written in a numbered list and should be detailed enough that anybody can follow them. It has to include the number of times or trials that you're going to run the experiment. So this is an example of what a procedure would look like for a very simple experiment. Procedures can get very, very long for more complex experiments. The observations or the data part of the experiment would be any measurements that you gather while performing that experiment. All of these measurements or all of this data is recorded in some sort of pre-made data table, something that you make before you start the experiment. This is an example of what one might look like for our ketchup experiment. We have ketchup that's stored in the freezer, the refrigerator, and on the counter. Those are our independent variable. And then you have the temperature at each of those locations. And then you have the time it takes for the ketchup in each temperature to drip off the spoon. Notice here that they're doing 3 trials for each temperature and taking the average. Once you've obtained your data, then it's time to graph your data. This is always important to include with any written analysis that you were to hand in or to publish, and it allows you to analyze and then understand the outcome of the experiment. This is part of your assignment. You need to follow these guidelines here to, when I go to the next slide, you'll see a graph of the ketchup experiment. And what I'd like you to do is write a paragraph telling me or analyzing what happened in the experiment. These are the things that you need to include in your paragraph. What do you now believe as a result of the experiment or observations? Remember, our question is, does the temperature at which ketchup is stored affect the thickness? Then you need to restate the hypothesis, which was stated earlier, the if-then-because statement. And lastly, you need to support your claim. You need to support what you believe happened with at least 2 pieces of data. You need to give me the numbers, including the averages. So the graph in this slide gives you the averages for the freezer ketchup, the refrigerator ketchup, and the ketchup stored on the counter. It is now your job to write an analysis paragraph at the end of all of your questions, telling me how the experiment turned out, telling me what your findings were. And in the real world, when the experiment is finished, scientists would share their results with other scientists so that the experiment can be repeated, retested, retried to see if the same results happen over and over.